Yellowstone's beauty is a lie. They warn you about the bears, the geysers, the sudden blizzards that can bury you in minutes. They don't warn you about the rules. I'm a park ranger. My name is Alex. A few weeks ago, I found the radio belonging to a man who vanished in this sector last year. He learned the final rule. Last night, his radio taught me the first one. It began with the silence. That's what I came for, after all. I'd spent 6 years as a ranger in the crowded corridors of Yosemite, where the roar of waterfalls was often drowned out by the roar of tour buses and the chatter of 1,000 tourists trying to capture the same perfect selfie. It was a job, but it was a loud one. My soul felt cluttered. So, when the transfer to Yellowstone's thoroughfare sector opened up, I jumped at it. It's the most remote location in the lower 48 states, a place you can only reach after a multi-day trek on foot or horseback. No roads, no cell service, no people. Just miles and miles of pristine, untamed wilderness cradled by the Absaroka Range. It was perfect. My first 3 weeks were a kind of baptism. The silence here wasn't empty. It was a living thing, a presence composed of 1,000,000 tiny, natural sounds. The whisper of wind through the ancient lodgepole pines, the distant, mournful bugle of an elk at dawn, the gentle lapping of Yellowstone Lake's frigid water against a shoreline of black volcanic sand. My station was a small, sturdy cabin built decades ago, solid and smelling of wood smoke and pine pitch. My days were spent on long, solitary patrols, checking trails, monitoring wildlife, and feeling the knots in my shoulders, accumulated from years of city noise and stress, finally begin to unwind. I was reconnecting with the reason I became a ranger in the first place, to be a quiet steward in a world that had forgotten how to be quiet. The beauty was overwhelming, almost violent in its grandeur. Sunsets would set the entire sky on fire, painting the jagged peaks in hues of orange and purple that felt too vivid to be real. I would sit on the porch of my cabin, a tin mug of coffee warming my hands, and just watch the world breathe. In that profound isolation, I felt more myself than I had in years. I felt safe. I felt free. The wilderness was vast and indifferent, and in its indifference, there was a strange kind of peace. It didn't care about my past, my anxieties, or my future. It just was, and I was privileged enough to simply be in it. The incident happened on a Tuesday, during a routine patrol along the southern edge of my assigned area, near a place the old maps called Petrified Creek. It was named for a strange localized cluster of trees that had been mineralized by some ancient geothermal event. They stood like gray stone skeletons against the vibrant green of the living forest, their limbs twisted and frozen in time. It was an eerie, beautiful place. While navigating a section of dense undergrowth just off the trail, my boot snagged on something hard. I expected a root or a rock, but when I looked down, I saw the corner of something man-made peeking through the damp soil and pine needles. Curiosity piqued. I knelt and dug it out. It was a ranger's radio, an older model, the kind we used before the upgrade to the new digital units. The yellow casing was scuffed and scarred, the antenna slightly bent. It felt heavy and cold in my hand, a dead piece of technology in a world teeming with life. As I brushed the dirt from its face, my heart gave a little jolt. Tucked beneath it, half buried in the mud, was a tarnished brass badge. I picked it up and wiped it clean on my trousers. The name engraved below the iconic bison emblem was clear: Ranger T. Miller. The name was familiar. Thomas Miller was my predecessor in this sector. The official story was that he'd vanished a little over a year ago. The search party found his horse, its tack still on, grazing peacefully by a stream. They found his pack and his tent neatly set up, but they never found him. The consensus was a bear attack, a swift, brutal encounter that left nothing behind. It was a tragic but accepted risk of the job, a grim reminder that no matter how experienced you are never the apex predator out here. Holding his radio and badge felt final. It was like finding a tombstone where there was no grave. I stood there for a long moment, the silence of the petrified forest pressing in on me. I tried to imagine Miller's last moments. Was he scared? Was it quick? A shiver traced its way down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. I clipped the radio to my belt, pocketed the badge and marked the location on my GPS. Back at my cabin that evening, the setting sun casting long skeletal shadows from the pines, I radioed my supervisor, a gruff but fair man named Harris, who managed the district from a station 50 miles away. "Harris, this is Alex at Thoroughfare Station. Come in." The radio crackled to life. "Got you, Alex. What's up? Everything quiet out your way?" "Affirmative, but I found something on patrol today. Over by Petrified Creek, I found Ranger Miller's radio and his badge." There was a long pause on the other end, long enough for me to wonder if we'd lost the connection. The only sound was the faint hiss of static. Finally, Harris's voice came back, but his tone wasn't what I expected. There was no surprise, no real concern, just a deep, weary flatness. "Copy that, Alex. Miller's gear. Figured it'd turn up eventually. Or parts of it anyway. Should I treat this as a potential search area? Maybe he made it further than they thought." "Negative," Harris said, his voice firm. "The case is closed, son. The bears and the wolves, they don't leave much behind. Nature's a big place, and it has a way of cleaning up after itself. Just bag the items and bring them with you on your next supply run. Harris out." The line went dead, leaving me in a cabin that suddenly felt much smaller and much darker. His apathy was unsettling. It felt less like professional detachment and more like avoidance, like he knew something I didn't and had no intention of sharing it. I placed Miller's radio on the rough-hewn wooden table in the center of the room. It sat there under the warm glow of my lantern, an object of silent tragedy. Later that night, unable to sleep, I decided to clean it. I took a damp cloth and gently wiped away the year's worth of grime. The serial numbers were still visible on the back. As I worked, my thumb accidentally pressed the power button. I expected nothing to happen. The battery should have been dead for months, but to my astonishment, a small red light flickered on for a second, and a soft hiss of static emanated from the speaker before it died again. The battery had held a ghost of a charge. I tried again, holding the button down. The light came on and stayed on. The speaker crackled, a sound like frying bacon filling the quiet cabin. I cycled through the channels, but all I got was static. Still, I left it on, the white noise a strange sort of company. As I sat there listening to the random chaos of the airwaves, I thought I heard something else, buried deep beneath the hiss. A whisper. It was too faint to make out any words, just a soft, sibilant sound that rose and fell like a breath. I leaned closer, straining my ears. The sound was gone. "Just my imagination," I murmured to myself, the sound of my own voice startlingly loud. Auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns in random noise, perfectly logical, perfectly explainable. I was tired, my mind playing tricks on me after a long day and a grim discovery. I switched the radio off, and the profound silence of the wilderness rushed back in to fill the space. But this time, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt watchful. I finally managed to drift off to sleep around midnight. The image of that tarnished badge burned into my mind. I was pulled from a deep, dreamless state by a sound, a sharp, loud burst of static that made me sit bolt upright in my bunk, my heart hammering against my ribs. My eyes darted around the dark room, searching for the source, and then I saw it. A single, steady red light was glowing from the table. Miller's radio was on. It hadn't just turned on. It was broadcasting. The static was different this time. It was louder, harsher, and underneath it there was something else, a sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end. It was a low, guttural noise, a wet, clicking sound like a Geiger counter submerged in mud. It wasn't animal. It wasn't human. It was something utterly alien. I sat frozen, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I was paralyzed by a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity. The guttural clicking continued for maybe 30 seconds, a rhythmic pulsing sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. And then, it stopped. The static cleared instantly, replaced by a perfect, chilling silence. My breath hitched in my throat. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, a voice erupted from the speaker. It was a man's voice, ragged and shredded by pure, undiluted panic. It was a scream that had been honed into a whisper. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul that I was listening to the last moments of Ranger Thomas Miller. "Rule number 1, the voice rasped, each word a desperate gasp for air. "If you hear something imitating your voice, it's not an echo." The radio clicked off. Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. The friendly quiet of the wilderness I had come to love was gone, replaced by a predatory void. I was no longer a steward in a peaceful world. I was a trespasser in a place with secrets, a place with rules. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window pane, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt the crushing, terrifying weight of being truly and utterly alone, or worse, of not being alone at all. I don't know what that was, but I know I'm not just a ranger in a remote outpost anymore. I'm a piece in some kind of game I don't understand. If you want to find out what happened to Ranger Miller, if you want to know what's happening to me, subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Let me know I'm not the only one listening. Please. Sleep did not come again that night. How could it? Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that ragged, desperate whisper from the radio. "It's not an echo." I spent the hours until dawn sitting on my bunk, my service pistol resting on my lap, its cold weight a pathetic comfort against a fear that was anything but physical. The darkness outside the cabin windows was no longer a simple absence of light. It was a smothering blanket, a tangible presence that seemed to press against the glass, waiting. The familiar night sounds of the forest, the chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a lone wolf were gone. Or perhaps they were still there, but my ears could no longer process them. All I could hear was the ringing silence left in the wake of that impossible transmission. When the first weak grey light of dawn finally seeped through the pines, it brought no relief, only a clearer view of my prison. I looked at the radio, sitting inert and silent on the table. It was just a piece of plastic and metal again. A dead thing. I picked it up, my hand trembling slightly, and examined it from every angle. The battery compartment was secure. The casing was solid. There was no rational explanation. My mind, desperate for an anchor in the storm, cycled through the possibilities. A bizarre, elaborate prank by the other rangers. Unlikely. The effort would be immense, and the tone... That wasn't a joke. That was the sound of a man's soul being shredded. A hallucination, then. Auditory psychosis brought on by the extreme isolation. It felt plausible. It felt sane. And I clung to that possibility, like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. But I knew I couldn't just sit here and let my sanity fray at the edges. I needed answers. I needed files. I needed to see Miller's official record with my own eyes. Harris's dismissive tone over the radio now seemed less like apathy and more like a deliberate deflection. He didn't want me looking. And that was the only reason I needed to do exactly that. I packed a light bag, grabbed the dead radio and the tarnished badge, and left a note on the cabin door indicating I was heading to the lake station for a supply run, a journey that would take the better part of the day on foot. As I locked the door behind me, the simple click of the deadbolt felt like a laughably futile gesture. The hike, which only a few days ago would have been a meditative joy, was now an exercise in controlled paranoia. The forest had transformed. The towering lodgepole pines, once majestic sentinels, now felt like silent, judging observers. Their long shadows seemed to stretch and twist in my peripheral vision. The path itself, a trail I had walked a dozen times, felt subtly wrong, as if its curves were slightly different, its inclines steeper. I kept pulling out my map and compass, my heart thudding with a new, irrational fear that the landscape itself was lying to me. Every sound was a potential threat. The caw of a raven made me flinch. Was it a real raven or a perfect imitation? The wind whispering through the high branches sounded like it was forming words just on the edge of my hearing. I started humming to myself, a tuneless, nervous sound, just to fill the silence with something I could control. Then I stopped abruptly, Miller's warning echoing in my mind. What if I hummed, and something from the trees hummed back in perfect pitch? The thought was so terrifying that I walked the rest of the way in rigid silence, my ears straining, my senses screaming. The comforting isolation I had sought had become the most terrifying aspect of my life. There was no one to call for help. No one to confirm that what I was experiencing was real. I was alone with the growing doubt in my own mind. Hours later, I emerged from the tree line and saw the reassuringly solid shapes of the Lake Ranger station. Smoke curled from the chimney of the main lodge, and the sight of other people, a couple of rangers checking equipment by a truck, sent a wave of relief through me so powerful it almost buckled my knees. I had made it back to the normal world. The relief was short-lived. Inside the lodge, I found Harris in his office, poring over budget reports. He looked up as I entered, his face an impassive mask. I placed the radio and badge on his desk. "The items you asked me to bring back," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my gut. Harris glanced at them, then pushed them to the side with the back of his hand as if they were contaminated. "Right, thanks for that. Your supply crate is waiting for you in the quartermaster's store." He looked back down at his paperwork, a clear dismissal. "Sir," I pressed on, "I'd like to see Miller's file, the full incident report, and his patrol logs from the weeks leading up to his disappearance." Harris didn't look up. He just sighed, a long, weary sound of pure exasperation. "Alex, I told you, the case is closed. Reading the file won't change that. It won't bring him back. With all due respect, sir, I'm stationed in his sector now. I have a right to know the full history of the area I'm patrolling." He finally lifted his gaze, and his eyes were cold and hard as river stones. "There's nothing in that file that will help you do your job. It's all speculation, animal behavior, weather patterns, search grids. It's just paper. Let it go." His resistance was the confirmation I needed. This wasn't bureaucratic laziness. This was a wall, deliberately constructed. I was about to argue further when another ranger, an old-timer named Elias, walked past the open office door. Elias was a fixture at Yellowstone, a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same granite as the mountains. He was due to retire in a few months. He paused, looking from Harris's stern face to mine, and a flicker of something, pity, maybe recognition, crossed his features. "Let the kid see the file, Harris," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "He's not going to rest until he does. Better he gets it out of his system." Harris stared at Elias for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, he grunted and waved a hand toward a back room filled with gray filing cabinets. "Fine. Knock yourself out. Archives are through there. Don't make a mess." As I walked toward the archive room, Elias put a hand on my shoulder, stopping me. He leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper, his breath smelling of stale coffee and wintergreen. "Some places, son, they got a memory, and they don't like being reminded. You read what you have to, but my advice? Take your supplies, go back to your cabin, and learn to ignore the things you can't explain. Miller couldn't do that." He gave my shoulder a firm squeeze and then walked away, leaving me colder than before. The archive room was cold and smelled of dust and decaying paper. I found the cabinet marked Personnel Incidents and located the file for Thomas Miller. It was surprisingly thin. I sat at a small table and read through it. It was exactly as Harris had described. Dry, procedural, clinical, search patterns, expert opinions on grizzly bear feeding habits, a timeline of the failed search and rescue operation. There was a statement from Harris officially closing the case, but the most important part, the part I came for, was missing. Miller's patrol logbook, which should have been included as evidence, was gone. In its place was a note. "Logbook not recovered from field." A lie. Rangers are drilled from day one. Your logbook is your life. You protect it at all costs. Miller would have had it on him. Either they found it and removed it from the file, or they were lying about not finding his body at all. The cover-up was real. Frustrated, my mind racing, I thought about what Elias had said, about Miller. An idea sparked. I left the archive room and made my way to the station's locker bay. It was a long shot, but I needed to see. Most of the lockers had names on them. I walked down the rows until I found it at the very end, a locker with a simple nameplate that read T. Miller. It was locked, but it looked unused, almost like a shrine nobody dared to disturb. I looked around. The bay was empty. I took a small pry bar from my multi-tool and with a sharp crack forced the simple lock. The inside was pathetically bare. An old pair of worn-out hiking boots, a faded photograph of a woman smiling, and an empty water bottle. That was it. My shoulders slumped. It was a dead end. I was about to close the door when my foot brushed against the metal floor of the locker. It felt loose. I knelt down. One of the thin metal plates that made up the floor seemed to have a slight give to it. My heart began to pound. I worked my fingers under the edge and lifted. It came up easily, and there in the shallow space beneath was a small leather-bound notebook, exactly the kind we were issued for personal field notes. My hands shook as I picked it up. This was it. This was what they didn't want anyone to find. I flipped it open. The first page had Miller's name and the date he was assigned to the thoroughfare sector, but this was no ordinary log. The writing, neat at first, grew increasingly frantic and spidery as the pages went on. It wasn't a record of his patrols. It was a record of his sanity unraveling. It was a list titled Rules for Surviving This Sector. My blood ran cold as I read the first entry. Rule number 1. If you hear something imitating your voice, it's not an echo. It was real. The radio transmission was real. I sank to the floor, my back against the cold metal lockers, and continued to read, my world shrinking to the frantic ink on the yellowed pages. Rule number 2. The trails shift when you're not looking. Trust your compass, not your memory of the path. The forest wants you to get lost. Rule number 3. Do not leave any personal items outside the cabin after sunset, especially photographs. It learns from them. Rule number 4. Sometimes at night, you will see a single light deep in the woods like a lantern. It is not another person. It is a lure. Do not investigate. Rule number 5. Never answer a knock on the door or a call of your name after dark. You are miles from anyone, and whatever is out there is not your friend. Rule number 6. Do not trust your reflection in still water when the sun is low. What you see looking back is not always you. Rule number 7. Some trees have memories. Do not touch the ones that bleed a red sap. They will show you things that break your mind. On and on it went. A dozen rules, each one more bizarre and terrifying than the last. They were a litany of psychological horror, a survival guide for a reality that had been twisted into a nightmare. I thought of my journey here, the feeling that the trail was wrong, my innate fear of the sounds in the forest. Miller hadn't gone mad. He had been paying attention. I flipped to the last page of the list, expecting the final, most important piece of the puzzle, but the page was empty, except for a heading that read, The Final Rule. The rest of the page and the 2 pages behind it had been violently torn out, leaving only ragged scraps behind. What was the final rule? What was the last piece of advice, so terrible or so crucial that Miller had ripped it from his own journal? I carefully tucked the notebook inside my jacket, my mind reeling. I gathered my supplies in a daze, avoiding eye contact with the other rangers. They exchanged knowing, pitying glances. They weren't part of a conspiracy to hurt me. They were part of a conspiracy to ignore the truth, to pretend the monster in their backyard didn't exist. They had decided it was better to sacrifice a ranger every few years than to admit that a sector of Yellowstone National Park was governed by a set of impossible, malevolent rules. The hike back to my cabin was a journey into the heart of fear. Every rule from the notebook was now a flashing warning sign in my mind. Every pool of water, every strangely colored tree, every flicker of light was a potential trap. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes, and I remembered rule number 6, forcing myself to look away from the placid, beautiful lakes I passed. The world I had come to for peace was now a minefield. The beauty was just the bait on the hook. I finally reached my cabin as the last light of day bled from the sky, fumbling with the keys, my back screaming with the imagined sensation of being watched. I slammed the door shut, bolted it, and leaned against the solid wood, gasping for breath. My sanctuary was now a cage. My solitude, once a comfort, was now my greatest vulnerability. I slid to the floor, pulling out Miller's journal. I read the rules again and again under the unsteady light of my lantern, the words burning themselves into my brain. They were my only weapon, and the most important one was missing. Outside, the wind began to howl, and it sounded like it was whispering a question over and over, a question I couldn't answer. The game had begun and I had just been handed the rulebook, an incomplete, terrifying rulebook, and I was the only player. The 2 days following my trip to Lake Station were a masterclass in self-imposed imprisonment. I was no longer a ranger. I was a hermit, a prisoner of a few hundred square feet of wood and glass. Miller's journal became my Bible. I read the rules until the frantic script was seared into my memory, each one a commandment in a new and terrible religion. I became a creature of ritual and superstition. I used my compass to walk the 10 feet from my porch to the woodpile. I ate my rations cold, straight from the can, terrified that the smell of cooking food would be an invitation. I never, ever looked directly at the placid surface of the nearby creek, even when filling my water bottles, instead staring at my boots the entire time. At night, the cabin became a fortress of flimsy hope. I draped a blanket over the single window, not to block the view out, but to block any view in. I stuffed a rag into the keyhole. I sat with my back to the thickest wall, Miller's journal in one hand and my pistol in the other, and I listened. The silence was my enemy now. It was an active, malevolent thing, a canvas upon which my fear painted horrifying sounds. I would hear phantom footsteps in the pine needles outside, a soft scratching at the door that would vanish the moment I held my breath, a whisper on the wind that almost sounded like my name. My lifeline to the outside world, my service radio, sat on the table like a dormant viper. I had my scheduled check-ins with Harris, and the conversations were a bizarre theater of normalcy. Thoroughfare, this is Lake Station. Status check, Alex. Lake Station, this is Alex. All clear. Sector is quiet. Quiet. The word felt like a blistering lie in my mouth. But what could I say? Sir, I found a dead man's secret diary, and I think the forest is a sentient monster playing a game with my mind. They'd have me airlifted out for a psych evaluation before I could finish the sentence. Elias's warning echoed in my mind. They knew. They all knew something was wrong with this place, and they had chosen willful ignorance as their survival strategy. I was completely, utterly on my own. On the third night, the entity decided it was done playing with subtlety. It began not with Miller's radio, but with mine. It was just after dusk, the sky a deep bruised purple outside my blanketed window. The air was dead still. My service radio, which had been silent for hours, suddenly crackled to life with a burst of static that made me jump. It wasn't my scheduled check-in. I grabbed it, my thumb hovering over the transmit button. Lake Station, is that you? Come in. Only static answered. But then, through the hiss, a voice began to coalesce. It was a woman's voice, warm and familiar, a voice I hadn't heard live in over a year, a voice that was currently 3,000 miles away in Florida. It was my mother. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a recording, a perfect snippet of a phone call we'd had right after I accepted the Yellowstone transfer. Her voice, clear as if she were in the room, said, "Yellowstone? Oh, Alex, that's wonderful. But my goodness, be careful out there. It's so wild." My own voice replied, a ghost from a happier time. "I'll be fine, Mom. It's what I'm trained for. It's going to be peaceful." The recording looped. "Be careful out there. It's so wild. Going to be peaceful. Wild. Peaceful." Then the recording began to warp. The words stretched and twisted, the pitch descending into something demonic. My mother's gentle concern became a low, mocking growl. "Wield." My own optimistic voice turned into a taunting, hollow echo. "Peaceful." It was a symphony of my own personal hopes being turned into a weapon against me. It knew what I'd come here for, and it was showing me what a fool I had been. I slammed the radio down on the table, my hand shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't just a ghost, it wasn't just a random phenomenon. It was intelligent. It had access to my memories, to the very fabric of my life. Rule number 3 flashed in my mind. It learns from them. I hadn't left any photos out. I hadn't left anything. How? How could it know? The question was a black hole that threatened to swallow what was left of my sanity. The radio fell silent. For a full minute, the only sound was the frantic, ragged tempo of my own breathing. I thought it was over. A cruel, psychological jab. Then I heard it. It wasn't from the radio, it was from outside. just beyond the thin wood of the cabin door. A voice, soft and hesitant. My mother's voice. "Alex?" My heart stopped. It wasn't a recording. It was live. It was perfectly pitched, filled with the exact cadence of maternal worry I knew better than my own heartbeat. "Alex? Honey, are you in there? I came to surprise you. The man at the other station said you were out here. My goodness, it's dark." I scrambled backward, my back hitting the cold stone of the fireplace, my mind screaming, "Impossible, impossible, impossible." She was in Florida. She was thousands of miles away. It was a trick, a mimicry. Rule number 1, it's not an echo. Rule number 5, never answer a knock on the door or a call of your name after dark. "Honey, open the door," the voice pleaded, closer now, right at the door. I could almost feel the vibration through the floorboards. I was so worried. It's cold out here. Tears streamed down my face. A part of my brain, the logical, rational part, was screaming at me that this was the entity, the monster from the journal. But there was another part, a deeper, more primal part, the part that was a lonely, terrified child that desperately wanted to believe. It yearned for the comfort and safety that voice promised. It was the most sophisticated form of torture imaginable, dangling the one thing I wanted most in the world just on the other side of a plank of wood. The doorknob rattled. "Alex, please, let me in. Something's out here with me. I'm scared." The voice rose in panic, a perfect imitation of my mother's fear. It was a masterstroke of cruelty. It was using my love for her as a key, trying to force me to betray the very rules that were keeping me alive. I squeezed my eyes shut, clapping my hands over my ears. I began to chant, my voice a choked whisper. Rule 1, it's not an echo. Rule 5, do not answer. Rule 1, it's not an echo. Rule 5, do not answer. Outside, the pleading stopped. The voice changed. It dropped the pretense of warmth and became something cold and flat. "I know you're in there, Alex," my mother's voice said, now devoid of all emotion. "You can't hide forever." Miller tried. And then, a sound that broke me. A soft, wet tapping started on the door. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of something slick and heavy being gently thumped against the wood, over and over. Thump, 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 thump. With sickening clarity, I imagined what it was. It was using my love for her as bait, and now it was using my fear for her as a hammer. I stayed there, huddled on the floor, for hours. The tapping eventually faded away, replaced by the returning wind. I didn't sleep. I just watched the blanket over the window, waiting for the sun, convinced that at any moment a shape would tear through it. The following days bled into one another in a haze of sleep-deprived terror. I had to go outside for water, for firewood. Each trip was a frantic, desperate scramble, my head on a swivel, my senses on fire. The forest, once my solace, was now a hall of mirrors. I saw movement where there was none. The wind in the pines sounded like a chorus of mocking whispers. The vibrant beauty of Yellowstone had become grotesque, a monstrous mask hiding an unspeakable face. The brilliant colors of the grand prismatic spring, which I could see steaming in the distance on clear days, no longer looked beautiful. They looked like a chemical burn on the skin of the earth. It was during a water run late one afternoon that I experienced the chilling proof of rule number 6. The sun was low, casting long, distorted shadows and bathing the landscape in a blood-orange light. I was at the edge of a small, unnamed lake, its surface as still and reflective as black glass. I had been careful, keeping my eyes down, focusing only on filling my canteens. But as I stood up to leave, I stumbled on a loose rock. My arms flailed for balance, and for a single, sickening second, my gaze flicked up, and I saw my reflection. It was me, my jacket, my terrified face, my wide eyes. But it wasn't mimicking me. For the briefest fraction of a moment, as I was falling backward, my reflection stood perfectly still. It didn't stumble. It watched me, its head cocked to the side at an angle that was just slightly wrong, an anatomically impossible angle. Its expression wasn't mine. Mine was one of panic. Its was one of placid, clinical observation. It was like a scientist staring at a bug under a microscope. I screamed, a raw animal sound, and scrambled away from the water's edge, falling hard onto the rocky shore. When I dared to look again, my reflection was gone, replaced by the ripples from my canteen that had slipped from my hand and splashed into the lake. I lay there, gasping, the sharp rocks digging into my back. It was undeniable now. I wasn't losing my mind. Miller wasn't crazy. This was real. A world with a different set of rules, and I was caught in it. I finally understood that hiding and following the rules was not a strategy for survival. It was a strategy for a slow, agonizing defeat. It was waiting for the entity to find a rule I didn't know, or a loophole I couldn't predict. The only way to survive, the only way to fight back, was to understand, to learn. Lying there on the shore, the monstrous stillness of my reflection burned into my retinas. I made a decision. I could not be the hunted anymore. I had to become the hunter. I had to find out what it wanted, what the game was, and most importantly, what Miller had learned at the end. I had to find the final rule, even if I had to break every other one to do it. The fear was still there, a cold, solid knot in my stomach. But now it had a new companion, a desperate, reckless resolve. The entity had shown me its face in the water. Now, I was going to find a way to make it show me its hand. The reflection in the lake broke something inside me. It shattered the paralysis of fear and replaced it with a cold, jagged shard of something else. Rage. It was the rage of a cornered animal, the fury of a mind pushed to the precipice of the abyss and shown the grinning face of the void. Hiding in my cabin, clinging to Miller's rules, was a death sentence. It was a slow, agonizing descent into madness, punctuated by the entity's cruel little games. That thing in the water, the impassive, observational me, it wasn't trying to scare me, it was studying me, it was learning. And I realized, with a clarity that was itself a form of terror, that I had been looking at this all wrong. I was not being haunted by a ghost. I was being gauged by a predator. My strategy had to change. I was no longer interested in surviving the night. I was interested in surviving, period. And that meant understanding the nature of the trap I was in. Miller had tried. He had observed. He had recorded. He had created his list of commandments. But he had failed. Why? Because he never found the final rule. He had the how of survival, but not the why of the phenomenon. I would not make the same mistake. I would tear this place apart, metaphorically and literally if I had to, until I found an answer or it found me. The hunt began in the one place I had any control, the cabin. Miller had lived here. He had died here, in a sense. He must have left more behind than the journal in his locker. For the next 48 hours, I became a frantic archaeologist of my own prison. I ran my fingers over every floorboard, searching for a loose one. I tapped every inch of the stone fireplace, listening for a hollow sound. I emptied the scant contents of the cupboards, checking for false bottoms. Nothing. It was just a simple, solid, maddeningly ordinary cabin. Defeated, I slumped onto the thin mattress of the bunk, my head in my hands. The place was clean. Too clean. It was as if it had been scrubbed of any personality, any history before I arrived, and that in itself was a clue. It meant someone, Harris probably, had sanitized the scene after Miller's disappearance, but they wouldn't have rebuilt the cabin from scratch. There had to be something they missed. My eyes fell on the heavy, dark wood footlocker tucked under the lower bunk. It was standard issue, used for storing extra blankets and winter gear. I had opened it once when I first arrived, noted its contents, a few musty wool blankets, and shut it again. But now I looked at it with new eyes. It was old, much older than the rest of the furniture. The wood was darker, the iron clasps pitted with age. It didn't belong. I dragged it out. It was heavy, far heavier than a few blankets should be. I threw the blankets onto the floor, revealing the locker's wooden bottom. I ran my hands over it. Near one of the back corners, my fingers brushed against a small, almost imperceptible seam. A false bottom. My heart hammered against my ribs. I worked my fingernails into the crack and pried. The wood groaned in protest, and then a section of the floor lifted up. The smell that rose from the compartment below was one of ancient dust, dry rot, and forgotten time. It was not a treasure chest. It was a tomb. Inside was a chaotic jumble of objects, artifacts left behind not just by Miller, but by a succession of rangers who had manned this lonely outpost. They were fragments of lives, whispers from the abyss. I pulled them out one by one and laid them on the floor. There was a corroded silver locket containing a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a stern-looking man with a handlebar moustache, wearing a ranger uniform from the early 20th century. There was a single brittle page torn from a diary dated 1983. The handwriting was neat, feminine. It read, "The trail to the falls changed again today. I walked it yesterday. I know the turn is by the split rock aspen. Today the aspen was gone. The trail wound south. George says I'm tired, that I'm not used to the altitude. He doesn't believe me. But the forest, it feels like it's breathing. And it doesn't want me here." Beneath that I found a child's drawing, rendered in crayon on yellowed paper. It depicted a stick-figure man standing next to a cabin, while in the dark woods beyond, a single bright yellow eye floated in the darkness. The date on the back was 1967. There was a ranger stationed here then with his family. The file had said they left due to a family emergency. Another lie. It was a litany of terror stretching back decades. I was not the first. Miller was not the second. We were just the latest in a long repeating line of victims. This place, this sector, was a slaughterhouse that operated on a generational timescale. Each ranger was a new specimen, a new mouse in the maze. Each one experienced the strange lights, the shifting trails, the disembodied voices, and each one, it seemed, was either driven away or consumed. This wasn't a haunting. It was a harvest. This realization, as horrifying as it was, gave me strength. I wasn't battling a personal demon. I was facing a system, an ancient recurring pattern. And patterns have logic, patterns have weaknesses. As I sat there, surrounded by the ghosts of my predecessors, Miller's radio, which I had taken to carrying with me at all times, hissed to life. I braced myself for the sound of my mother's voice, for some new psychological torture. But it was different this time. It wasn't one voice, it was a chorus. The cacophony of voices, all male, all laced with panic, faded in and out of the static, overlapping and interrupting one another like a frantic chorus of the damned. The compass just spins, I swear to God. It's wearing Jacob's face, but its eyes are... Left the picture on the railing for 5 minutes, and now it knows her name. Don't follow the light, it's a trap. Don't follow the... They were echoes of the men who had come before, the man from the locket, the ranger whose wife wrote the diary page. They were all here, their final, terrified moments preserved in the electromagnetic ether, trapped in this machine. The entity wasn't just a mimic, it was an archivist of terror. It collected screams, it curated despair. It was using the radio not just to taunt me, but to show me its collection, to show me my place in its grand cyclical design. I was to be the next voice in the static. I switched the radio off, my hand shaking with a mixture of dread and grim determination. Listening to those voices, I understood something new. I was only seeing the effects, the ripples in the water. I wasn't seeing the stone that was thrown. All of Miller's rules were defensive. They were reactions. Don't do this, don't look there, don't answer that. You can't win a game by only playing defense. To understand the game, to see the opponent, you have to force a move. You have to break a rule. Deliberately. My eyes fell upon Miller's journal, which I had left open on the table. My gaze drifted down the list, past the rules I had already seen proven true, until it landed on one that had seemed more like a dark fairy tale than a warning. Rule number 7. Some trees have memories. Do not touch the ones that bleed a red sap. They will show you things that break your mind. They will show you things. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise of knowledge. The cost was sanity, but what was the alternative? To be whittled away night after night by a phantom that wore my mother's voice and a reflection that wore my face, to end up as another terrified whisper in a dead man's radio? No, I would rather face the abyss head-on than be pushed into it from behind. I needed to see. I needed to know what this thing was, what it wanted, even if the knowledge shattered me. The decision settled into my bones with the cold finality of a death sentence I had just written for myself. I would break rule number 7. I waited until the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the Absarokas. the time of day when the world felt thin, the veil between realities stretched taut. I put on my jacket, clipped Miller's radio to my belt, a silent, grim companion, and stepped out of the cabin. I did not look back. The walk to Petrified Creek was different this time. My paranoia was gone, replaced by a singular, terrifying purpose. The forest seemed to sense it. The air grew still. The birds fell silent. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. The world was a stage, and I was walking to my mark. I found them easily. A small grove of mineralized trees, their grey, stone-like bark a stark contrast to the living forest around them. And among them, one stood out. It was a gnarled ancient thing, its branches twisted into agonized shapes, and from a deep scar in its trunk, a thick, dark red substance oozed, defying the cold air. It wasn't sap. It was viscous, like crude oil, but the color of dried blood. It clung to the bark in thick, unctuous rivulets. The air around it smelled of old iron and something like burnt electricity. This was it. I stood before the tree, the setting sun casting my long shadow across it. This was the nexus, a point of contact. My mind screamed at me to turn back. Every instinct for self-preservation told me this was suicide, but the memory of my reflection's placid, alien gaze, the echoes of the dead rangers in the radio, they pushed me forward. My hand felt impossibly heavy as I raised it. I could feel a strange energy emanating from the tree, a low subsonic hum that vibrated through the soles of my boots. My fingers trembled as they neared the bleeding bark, 1 inch away. I could feel a palpable coldness radiating from the strange sap. I took a final ragged breath, and then I closed the gap. The moment my fingertips made contact with the cold, sticky substance, the world ended. It wasn't a sound, it was the absence of sound. The hum of the wind, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the entire symphony of the wilderness was extinguished in an instant, as if a switch had been thrown on the universe. A perfect, profound, and utterly unnatural silence fell. It was a vacuum of sound so complete that I could hear the blood roaring in my own ears. The pressure in the air changed, making my eardrums pop. The last rays of sunlight seemed to freeze in place. I had not just touched a tree, I had crossed a threshold into somewhere else, and I knew with chilling certainty that I was no longer alone. The transition was not a physical one. I did not fall, nor was I transported. One moment, I was a man standing in a forest, my hand pressed against the cold, viscous sap of a petrified tree. The next, the forest was gone. The world of sensory input, the smell of pine and damp earth, the feeling of the crisp mountain air on my skin, the sight of the setting sun was simply switched off. I was unmoored, a consciousness adrift in a silent, featureless void. It was not darkness. Darkness implies the absence of light. This was an absence of everything. There was no up or down, no sense of my own body. There was only the roaring of my own pulse, a frantic biological drumbeat against an eternal cosmic silence. My first thought was that I had died, that the sap was some kind of neurotoxin, and this was the final fleeting electrical storm of a dying brain. But there was no peace here. My terror was intact. My memory was sharp. My mind was horrifyingly, screamingly lucid. This wasn't death. It was something else. I tried to scream, but I had no mouth, no lungs. The impulse was there, a frantic burst of will, but it had nowhere to go. It was like trying to grasp smoke. Panic, raw and primal, began to consume me. To be lost in the wilderness was one thing. To be lost from existence itself was a horror my mind had no framework for. The rules, the cabin, Miller, it all felt like a story from another life, a distant, cherished memory of a time when things as simple as ground and sky still existed. Then a single point of sensation returned. My hand. I could feel the cold, sticky substance of the sap against my fingertips. It was my only anchor, the single point of contact between my reality and this. And through that connection, something began to flow. It wasn't a vision, not in the way one sees a dream. It was an injection of pure information, a torrent of raw data poured directly into my consciousness. Images, sounds, emotions, none of them my own, flooded me, a billion fractured moments all happening at once. I saw the world from 1,000 different perspectives. I saw a herd of colossal mammoths trumpeting as a river of molten rock consumed the valley. I felt the crushing weight of a glacier, a mile-thick, grinding stone into dust over millennia. I experienced the slow, patient life of a bristlecone pine, feeling the centuries pass like seasons. And I felt the hunger. It was not a hunger for food. It was a hunger for experience, for consciousness. I felt it awaken, an ancient geological intelligence, a mind born not of flesh and synapse, but of rock, heat, and time. It had slumbered for eons, aware only of the slow, grinding ballet of geology. The arrival of life, of thinking, feeling creatures was a novelty, a curiosity, and then a source of stimulation. It learned that it could touch their minds, taste their fears, experience their brief, frantic lives. It was like a man who has only ever known silence, suddenly hearing music for the first time. It was intoxicating. It became an addiction. I saw the first humans to walk this land, their minds full of a potent, fascinating mixture of reverence and fear for the strange power that emanated from the earth. The entity learned from them, tasted their primitive terror of the dark, of predators, of the unknown, and it learned to play. The visions became more specific, faster. I saw the first ranger, the stern-faced man from the locket, building the cabin, his mind full of pride and a pioneer's certainty. I felt the entity's curiosity as it brushed against his thoughts, learning the concepts of family, duty, loss. Then I felt its cold disappointment when his mind, rigid and unimaginative, refused to break. He fled the sector, attributing his wife's night terrors to female hysterics, his own unease to the altitude. He was a dull instrument. The pageant of victims continued. I experienced the terror of the woman from the 1983 diary entry as she realized the forest was actively, malevolently rearranging itself around her. I felt her husband's stubborn denial, a wall the entity could not breach. They left. I saw the family from the 1960s, felt the father's growing horror as his young son described his imaginary friend who lived in the woods and whispered his secrets back to him. They fled. Each was a brief, unsatisfying taste. Then I saw Miller. I experienced his arrival so much like my own, full of a quiet hope for solitude. But Miller was different. His mind was sharp, analytical. When the phenomenon began, he didn't dismiss it. He studied it. He documented it. He fought back with logic, creating his rules. The entity was fascinated. This was not a simple creature to be frightened. This was a game. For the first time, one of the mice was trying to map the maze. I was inside Miller's mind during his final days. I felt his abject terror as the voice of his deceased father called to him from the trees. I shared his sanity-shredding confusion when he saw his own doppelganger watching him from across a ravine, not moving, not threatening, just observing. I felt his scholarly curiosity curdle into obsessive dread. He was a scientist trapped in a haunted house, and the ghosts were rewriting the laws of physics around him. The entity savored his struggle, a connoisseur appreciating a vintage fear. The flood of information slowed, focusing on a single, final memory. Miller, gaunt and wild-eyed, standing exactly where I was standing now, his hand pressed to the same tree. He hadn't just touched it, he had understood that it was the source, the point of contact. He had come here for answers just as I had. The void around me solidified. The torrential influx of memories ceased. The profound silence remained, but now it had a focal point, a presence. And it spoke. There was no sound, no vibration. The words simply appeared in my mind, fully formed as if I had always known them. The voice was ancient, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a mountain, of a tectonic plate. It was the voice of the hunter. "You are not Miller." The statement was flat, observational. It was the same clinical curiosity I had seen in my reflection's eyes. No, I thought, my own consciousness a tiny, flickering candle in this immense silent space. I'm Alex. The designation is meaningless. The pattern is the same: curiosity, logic, desperation. You followed the path he laid, you found his notes, you learned his rules. And now you have come to the source. What are you? The question felt small, insignificant. I am the memory of this place, the guardian of its truths, the geologic mind. You perceive me as a hunter. Miller perceived me as a demon, others a ghost. I am none of those things. I am a constant. You are the variables. The entity's perspective was so vast, so alien, that I struggled to comprehend it. It wasn't evil. Evil is a human concept. It was a process, a fundamental force of nature, like erosion or gravity, that had developed a taste for the fleeting spark of mortal consciousness. Miller is not deceased, the voice stated, anticipating my next question. He is reassigned. What does that mean? He understood, as you are beginning to. The cycle is not sustainable through mere terror. The prey grows wary. The game becomes stale. A new element was required, a shepherd for the sheep. A cold, horrifying understanding began to dawn in the depths of my soul. I wasn't just a mouse in a maze. The maze itself was being redesigned. Miller was the first. He was offered a choice, the same choice I now offer you. Your current path ends in two ways. You can flee this place, and I will allow it. You will spend the rest of your short, frantic life telling stories no one will believe. Your sanity will fray, your memories will become nightmares, and you will wither into a paranoid shell. Or you can remain here, and your mind will be systematically disassembled, your fears consumed, until nothing remains. Those are the old ways. The entity paused, letting the weight of the pronouncement settle into my mind. A choice between a madhouse or annihilation. But there is a third path, a new role. Miller learned the final rule. It was not a warning. It was an invitation, an offer of employment. What are you talking about? This sector requires a sentinel, a consciousness to serve as the interface, an immortalized warning, a lure. Miller accepted his role. His fear, his voice, his desperation. They are now tools. They are the first notes of the new symphony used to test the next subject. He is not a victim anymore. He is part of the mechanism, the transmission. Rule number 1. It wasn't an echo of Miller's death. It was a broadcast. A deliberate, purposeful message from Miller himself, playing his part in the grand, horrific design. He wasn't a ghost. He was the groundskeeper. The position is now available to you, the ancient voice continued, its tone unchanging, like a scientist offering a lab rat a different pellet. The current game is nearing its conclusion. Your fear is palatable but finite. Your potential, however, is greater. You have the same analytical mind as Miller, but a deeper well of emotional connectivity. Your mother, your desire for peace. These are powerful resonances. As the new sentinel, you would not fade, you would endure. You would serve a purpose beyond your own survival. You would become a permanent part of this place. I was being offered a job, the groundskeeper of a psychological slaughterhouse, the gatekeeper of hell. The entity was proposing to elevate me from prey to accomplice, and if I refuse, then the game continues, but it will be accelerated. I have already learned everything I need from your mind. The testing phase is over. The silent void around me began to fray at the edges. I felt a pulling sensation, the feeling of my consciousness being drawn back to its physical shell. The connection was ending. The final rule is a choice, Alex, not a discovery. Go to the place where the geyserite grows like bone. There you will find Miller's legacy, and there you will make your decision, become the warning, or become the forgotten scream. The world rushed back in a deafening, painful wave. The sound of the wind was an explosion. The sight of the deep twilight was blinding. The feeling of the cold bark under my hand was an electric shock. I fell backward, scrambling away from the bleeding tree, my body convulsing. I lay on the cold ground, gasping, the smell of the forest filling my lungs. I was back, but I was not the same. The fear was still there, but it was now dwarfed by the sheer, crushing scale of the truth. There was no escaping. There was no winning. There was only a choice, to be erased or to become the eraser. I got to my feet, my legs unsteady. My mind was eerily calm, the frantic panic replaced by a cold, hollow clarity. I knew what I had to do. I had to go to the geyserite field. I had to see for myself. I had to read the job description. I took out my service radio and switched it on. My thumb trembled over the transmit button. I had to tell someone. I had to leave a record, even if it was my last. This is Ranger Alex Thorne, Thoroughfare Sector. Log entry, I don't know. Final. I've just made contact with it, the source, the thing that lives in the rock and the silence. It showed me everything. Miller, he's not dead. None of them are, not really. They're repurposed, and I've been given a choice. The same one he was given. I can let it break me down into nothing, just another forgotten scream in the static. Or I can accept a new role, a new position. The voice, it gave me a choice. It told me where to find the answer, the final piece of the puzzle. I'm going there now. So this is it, my last broadcast as me. For anyone out there listening, for anyone who finds this recording, leave a comment. Tell me what you think the final rule is. What terrible truth could be worse than everything I've already seen? What would you do in my place? Choose to be forgotten or choose to become a monster? Don't forget to subscribe, because I'm walking to my fate now. And one way or another, this will be the last thing you ever hear from Alex Thorne. The journey to the Geyserite field was not a hike, it was a funeral procession. The frantic, heart-pounding paranoia that had been my constant companion for days was gone, replaced by a vast, cold emptiness. I walked with the leaden certainty of a condemned man on his way to the gallows. The forest no longer felt threatening. It felt expectant. The ancient pines stood like silent attendees at a coronation, their boughs heavy with a silent judgment. The air, which I now knew was the very medium through which the entity perceived the world, was still and heavy, tasting of sulfur and finality. There were no animal sounds. The entire sector was a cathedral of silence, and I was the sacrifice walking down the aisle. I didn't need a map. A new and unwelcome instinct guided my feet, a magnetic pull toward the place I was meant to be. The ground beneath my boots began to change, the rich soil giving way to a pale, cracked earth that was warm to the touch. Steam hissed from fissures in the ground, smelling of boiled minerals and the planet's hot, secret core. The landscape grew increasingly alien, the vibrant greens of the forest receding, replaced by the bleached skeletal white of silica deposits. I emerged from the tree line and stopped, the sight before me stealing the breath from my lungs. It was a valley of bone, an entire field of geyserite formations, sculpted by millennia of geothermal activity, rose from the ground like the fossilized remains of some colossal long-dead leviathan. Rib cages of bleached silica arched into the twilight sky. Spines of jagged stone jutted from the steaming earth. It was a place of profound, sterile beauty, a graveyard built by the earth itself. It was the entity's throne room. In the very center of the skeletal landscape stood a single, massive formation. It wasn't a cone or a mound like the others. It was shaped like a great high-backed chair, a throne of pale, porous stone, intricate with the lacy patterns of deposited minerals. It looked both ancient and deliberate, and at its base, placed with the care of a museum curator, were the objects I had been sent to find. My legs moved on their own accord, carrying me across the warm, hollow-sounding ground. As I drew closer, I could see them clearly. A ranger's radio, the same model as Miller's, and a brass badge. Both were immaculate, free of any dirt or tarnish, gleaming softly in the dying light as if they had been polished just moments before. They were not discarded artifacts, they were regalia. A crown and scepter waiting for the next monarch. And next to them, leaning against the base of the stone throne, was a weathered piece of pine, flat and long like a plank. Carved into its surface, not with any artistry, but with a desperate, gouging urgency, were a few simple words. It was Miller's final testament, his legacy, the last piece of his puzzle. I knelt, my knees cracking in the profound silence. My fingers, numb and cold despite the warmth of the ground, traced the deep grooves of the letters. I read the words that had been torn from his journal. I read the final rule. You cannot save the next. You can only become the warning. The words did not horrify me. They did not surprise me. They simply slotted into place, the final gear in a mechanism of perfect cosmic cruelty that I now understood completely. The laughter that bubbled up from my chest was a broken, hideous sound that shattered the sacred silence of the valley. It was the laughter of a man who has finally, truly understood the punchline to a joke that has taken his entire world, his entire soul, as its setup. There was no escape. There never had been. The entire game, the rules, the fear, the investigation, it wasn't a test of survival. It was a job interview, a recruitment process. The entity didn't want to just eat the mice. It wanted to find the cleverest mouse, the one that learned the maze, and promote it to the role of zookeeper. It needed a conscious agent to refine the process, to make the warnings more potent, the terror more acute for the next candidate. Miller hadn't been defeated. He had been chosen. He had accepted the promotion. The ragged whisper on the radio wasn't a cry for help. It was his first day on the job. My struggle, my logic, my deep-seated fear for my mother, as the entity had said, these were not weaknesses. They were qualifications. I had passed the interview with flying colors. The hope that I could somehow outsmart it, that I could find a way to win, that had been the final, most rigorous part of the test. And by clinging to that hope, I had proven myself the perfect candidate. I looked at the polished radio and the gleaming badge. I looked at the throne of bone. I was not a victim. I was the heir apparent. My life as Alex Thorne was over, a story that had reached its final bitter page. All that was left was to choose what came next. Oblivion or purpose, a forgotten scream or a voice that would echo here for eternity. As I knelt there, lost in the wreckage of my own existence, a sound reached my ears. It was a sound so out of place in this sterile, silent valley that it felt like a gunshot. The snap of a twig. I lifted my head slowly. At the edge of the geyserite field, just emerging from the dark line of trees, was a figure, a man. He was wearing the same ranger uniform I was, and in the fading light I could see the fresh-faced, confident expression on his face. He held a map in one hand and a compass in the other, looking down at them with an expression of mild frustration. He was young, lost and insulated by a layer of blissful ignorance that felt like a memory from another lifetime. He was the next. He was the new variable. He was my replacement. A cold, calm clarity washed over me. The entity had not just offered me a choice. It had shown me the consequence of refusing. Without a sentinel, the game is crude. With one, it is art. My purpose was standing right there, 50 yards away, looking at a useless map. I reached out and picked up Miller's radio from the base of the throne. It felt different from mine. It was warm, humming with a latent energy, as if it were alive. I thumbed the transmit button. The new ranger, hearing the telltale click of a radio keying on, looked up, his face a mixture of relief and curiosity. He fumbled for his own radio, eager to make contact. I brought the radio to my lips. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream a warning, to tell him to run, to tell him to get out and never look back. But the words that came out were not the ones I intended. A voice emerged from the speaker, a voice that was built from my own, but was deeper now, layered, with a strange resonant echo that spoke with the authority of the ancient stone around me. It was the Sentinel's voice, and it knew its lines perfectly. Rule number 1, my new voice broadcasted across the silent waiting valley, clear and sharp in the twilight air. If you hear something imitating your voice, it's not an echo.